Okay, Jennifer, can you see the screen?
Yes, I can. And I
Awesome.
can hear you.
Yay, even better.
Hi there too.
So Brian, next screen. So that's us. So my name is Reed Dunbar and I'm a senior transportation planner at the City of Eugene, and I work primarily on walking and bicycling projects. And this project took about 8 years to develop, including the planning process, acquiring the funding, and then starting the design process, which is where Brian takes over. Brian, do you want to introduce yourself?
Brian Root, civil engineer here with City of Eugene. I was fortunate enough to be the third or fourth project manager to take this over once we got the grant and started design, but it's been a fun project.
Yeah, excellent. Next slide. So I'm going to go over the history of this project a little bit. As I mentioned, we started on the ground surveying the area in about 2012. And it went through a few iterations since then, but I'll talk about the planning process overall and how we engage the public, as well as our goals and outcomes for this project. And I think we did really well on that, and I think that's a testament to Brian. And then I'll talk about some issues and opportunities as well, and then we'll turn the whole thing over to Brian to really get into the design and some of the challenges that were experienced. It's one thing for me to say, here's the planning process, and Brian, let's put a bridge here. But it was Brian's job to say, okay, here's how we're going to put the bridge there. And he's got some stories to share about that. Next slide. So this is obviously a Google map of the Eugene area. We've got Fern Ridge sort of over on the left there in the blue. You can see a little red line sort of down in South Eugene there, and that's where our project was. South Eugene is interesting because we have actually pretty good mode share for active transportation. A lot of people down there walk and bike for a proportion of their trips, and we've got a very active bus line there too, or at least we did pre-COVID. It's also interesting because the Amazon Creek divides that neighborhood, with East Amazon Drive being on one side of the creek and West Amazon Drive being on the other. There are schools and parks on both sides. There's a running trail that is adjacent to the creek on both sides, but there's only one pedestrian bridge linking East Amazon to West Amazon. And there were bike lanes adjacent to basically the linear park that encompasses the Amazon Creek, but only bike lanes adjacent to that linear park. There weren't any on the other side. And I'll get into some of the challenges with that as I go through the presentation. And then very active bus route too. As I mentioned, we had pretty good mode share for people taking the bus to work here too. And so it was critical that we link the bus stops to whatever it is that we were going to do in terms of improvements, whether that be placing the bridges or making sure that we've connected to the bikeway appropriately. Next slide, Brian. So the area that we're talking about, and it looks like I didn't, okay. Yep, there's all the stuff. Thanks, Brian. So there was this concept that was developed about 2 decades ago called the Riverbank to Ridgeline Path. And the idea was you'd be able to go from the Willamette River and our extensive Riverbank Pass system on the north side there by Riverbank on your image, all the way to the Ridgeline Trail and Spencer Butte in the south, using a shared use path. And so people of all ages and abilities could walk or bike between these two amenities and feel very comfortable doing so. And so that middle section with the purple arrow is where we have an existing shared use path. So 1/3 of this is developed, and now actually 2/3 is developed because the bottom blue arrow has also been completed, which is the project we're talking about now. The northernmost blue arrow is a project that we're working on now and trying to figure out how to connect downtown to the Riverbank Pass system and extending this entire linear corridor or path system. But we've got a lot of guidance here too. And so the transportation system plan, its overarching goal for active transportation is to triple active mode shares. And so we know that we're going to have to provide a level of comfort and access to active transportation facilities that we don't currently have. So in this specific example, we have on-street bike lanes, which are separated by 8 inches of white stripe, and that's it. And when we survey people, they say, well, I feel comfortable on the shared use path system, which is separated from automobile traffic and where I feel comfortable riding with my family. And so the transportation system plan actually says, hey, let's get more of these facilities that feel like shared use paths throughout the system and really be able to connect our neighborhoods to our schools, through our parks and into our downtown and to our recreational amenities like the Willamette River. The climate recovery ordinance is also saying, let's reduce the amount of fossil fuels being burned for transportation. And so again, that suggests that we should be focusing on making walking, biking, and taking transit a little easier. And in this corridor, we have Amazon Creek that divides a neighborhood in half. And we also had, we did not have separation of facilities for different users either. So we knew that there was some work to do there. Vision Zero has also been adopted since we started this planning process. And so we wanted to make the facilities a little bit safer for everyone. Envision Eugene is our comprehensive land use plan, and it talks about 20-minute neighborhoods and getting folks to choose walking, biking, or taking the bus for active transportation for more trips. And so again, that relies on facilities that people feel comfortable using. We have a voter approved pavement bond measure. And what that does is it allows us to repave and rebuild streets that are failing or in need of repair. And we knew that East Amazon Drive as well as West Amazon Drive were coming up as part of that pavement bond. So as we consult the transportation system plan and with the other guidance that we had adopted, we knew that changes to East Amazon Drive and West Amazon Drive should probably be done in tandem with our pavement project. So there seemed to be a lot of opportunity there. And then at the same time, ODOT had a next round of bike ped grant funding available. So it was time to start scoping what this could look like and see if we could actually get to the riverbank to ridgeline path as part of this project. Next slide. So this is an actual photo from our design charrette. We started working with community-based organizations. The Southeast Neighborhood Association was primary in that, and that I started coordinating with them early on. It started with a neighborhood walkabout where we actually walked the linear park system adjacent to the Amazon path, took photographs, heard about how people were using this system, learned about some things that needed to be fixed. And I'll get into that in a second, but that's primarily to do with just that one bridge and that creek dividing the neighborhood in half. But this is also a neighborhood with active churches and schools and a Safe Routes to School program. And so we wanted to get all those partners together and be able to talk about what solutions would be best for this corridor. Excuse me, if you can hear a lawnmower in the background, it's because somebody's mowing my lawn right now. So I wish they weren't, but they are. So that's what that is. We also did some online surveys, and that was primarily to gauge people's preferences for facility types and also for locations for those bridges, because we felt like we were going to need to have some more connectivity between East and West Amazon. And so bridges were definitely going to be part of that. The question was, where should they go? In other words, is 35th Avenue a better place for people to cross than 36th? Is that better than 37th? They're from 33rd all the way down to basically, 45th. If it continued to go that way, that's how many blocks there were. And we weren't going to be able to put in 10 bridges. So we were going to have to decide where those went. When we decided what that box of parts might look like, in other words, when we said, okay, there's going to be some bridges, there's probably going to be some additional improvements, we got folks together and did a design charrette where we said, okay, here's the challenges for placement of bridges. Here is where we think we can put some bikeways. And then we had some open houses, and it was there that we learned about the struggles of our running trail, which was adjacent to the creek. And so where we started out as an on-street project working on, walking, biking, and transit, getting new pavement for people who are driving and for freight and delivery. We also noticed that the recreational trail adjacent to the creek was failing. So that became another part of this project that we decided we needed to address. And so we put all of that together and scoped out a project and applied for an ODOT grant. Next slide. Basically with that grant, we wanted to accomplish a couple things. Primarily, we wanted to increase comfort for all users so that we would have the people who aren't walking or biking for most trips right now feel comfortable that they could do that and that this would be a reasonable choice for them. While we were doing that, it would enhance safety because we were talking about physically separating the different travel modes. We also wanted to improve connectivity between the neighborhood. The Amazon Creek is a natural resource for us, and adjacent to it, there's a linear park system. And so there's a lot of great natural resources in there that we needed to protect. We had some protected species in there, some Bradshaw's lomatium, as well as our open space crew who was working on restoring the prairie and grassland. So we wanted to make sure that all of that was maintained. And then lastly, because we had those pavement bond measure projects, we wanted to be able to leverage this funding. So if we put together a project, hopefully we could be there one season or maybe 2 seasons and get the entire corridor done instead of going in once for a pavement project and then coming in for a bridge project and then coming in for another pavement project. Let's try to get this as grouped as we can so that the impact to the neighborhood is lessened. Next slide. So this is sort of fun with clip art, but this is sort of what the neighborhood ends up looking like as I think about it. The Amazon Creek runs down the middle. Those little brown boot tracks are a running trail. So on both sides of the creek, we had a running trail. We had one bridge that connected east to west, one pedestrian bridge. There are some bus routes throughout. And so connectivity is really important there. It's important to note that the bus itself travels south down West Amazon and drops people off on the west side of West Amazon, goes down to the end of the corridor at Martin Street, and then travels north on East Amazon. So what that meant is folks who lived on East Amazon would see their house as they were traveling down West Amazon, run the entire corridor, and then travel up East Amazon. And that was some delay. So what we noted and what we learned throughout the open house process is that some folks would choose to get out on West Amazon and then leap over the creek to get to East Amazon and then to go home. And we had actually found some signs of people who were taking some debris and making little bridges across the creek. And of course, that's not something that we want. And so we knew that the bridges were gonna have to line up with the transit stations at some point, and that that this had to be comfortable for people to use and make sense from a routing perspective so that folks weren't choosing to jump across a creek on their way home. Next slide. So there's probably 3 areas that I'm going to talk about in terms of planning, and then Brian will get into the details of how we actually built this stuff. But one of the areas is, if you look at the picture on the right, Hilliard Street runs down the center with the red line there. And there's shared use path on the north end at that purple arrow, and there's shared use path on the south end with the other purple arrow. And in between, there was a series of, say, 5 or 8 foot sidewalks, which didn't really make for a great transition between the shared use paths. So while we were looking at the Amazon corridor, we decided to add this as well. Next slide. So this is sort of an image of that. Starting at about 33rd, we still had about 10 feet of shared use path adjacent to Hilliard there. So this was extending the Amazon path to the south, but as you transitioned across 34th Avenue, it was like an 8-foot path. And as you transitioned across 34th Alley, it turned into this 5-foot sidewalk. And so we had a variety of different users, people walking with their kids, people walking their dogs, and also people bicycling in both directions on a 5-foot sidewalk. And so we knew that something had to change there. Next slide. When you got to that south end, there was a 12-foot path that led to some additional neighborhoods and shopping districts. And so it made sense to, in the next slide, to basically widen that whole thing out. And so Brian's going to talk a little bit about the challenges in widening that out. Initially, we thought we could take the planter strip and just basically add a sidewalk next to that. That did present some challenges, and then we had to rebuild some driveways and look at the right-of-way throughout. But the overall idea was that let's extend this path with a path that looks like our regular shared use path system, so that we're connecting a standard 12-foot path with a standard 12-foot path with a standard 12-foot path. And so that sounds simple, but Brian will get into some of the details there. Next slide. So the second area is the main focus of this and where most of the work occurred. This includes the paving projects on both East Amazon and West Amazon, paid for through our pavement bond measure. This is also where some of those bridges should have been located, because we had, again, those bus stops were located throughout, shopping districts on the north, 2 schools on the south, 1 on East Amazon, 1 on West Amazon, and then a variety of multifamily and single family throughout. Next slide. Due to a variety of environmental constraints, we weren't actually able to put in a shared use path in that linear park system. And so we were relegated to the existing right-of-way. And so the right-of-way existed of about 36 feet curb to curb. It was being used on both East Amazon and West Amazon in approximately this configuration. There was a 5-foot bike lane adjacent to the linear park. Adjacent to that was a travel lane. Both corridors were posted at 35 miles per hour. So as you can imagine, the comfort on that system, it's also pretty straight, was pretty low because folks were going fast and they could encroach in the bike lane a little bit. On the other side of the center line, there was another through lane and then basically a parking lane that also served as a transit lane. And so with only 1 bike lane, folks who lived on East Amazon mostly used East Amazon in both directions, and folks who lived on West Amazon mostly used West Amazon in both directions, which meant that if you were riding a bike and you didn't have a bike lane in that direction, you were sort of squeezed in between the parking lane and the through lane. And that led to a lot of people choosing not to ride bikes on this corridor because of the speed, because of the amount of traffic, and because they didn't have a dedicated facility. Next slide. So another issue on this corridor was that creek, as I mentioned. This is what that existing bridge looked like. If you go forward, Brian, do we get another image? Yeah, so one more. So basically, this is a demonstration of the bus stop location. So you'd go in one direction on one of the Amazon drives, and then if you lived on the other side, a lot of people were deciding just to get off the bus and to sort of make their way across the creek and across the parkland to their homes. There are 2 schools, which are elementary schools in this corridor as well. The kids, I think, love to jump the creek, but that's obviously not something that we were promoting. And so we wanted to get some more bridges in there. The existing bridge that we had a number of challenges as well. It was an old wood bridge, it wasn't lit. And then it was also very steep. The approaches were not ADA compliant. So next slide. We chose to address the on-street bikeway with a protected bike lane. This is not a photo of that. This is what we used for demonstration. This one is from Seattle. But basically what we were proposing was a 12-foot bikeway, which with a 6-foot bike lane in each direction and a concrete separated barrier that would separate people biking from people driving. We would have gaps in that concrete separator so that folks who lived adjacent to the bikeway could escape the bikeway and then get into their driveway. Of course, green colorant and conflict areas. The rub with this was that we were going to have to remove the on-street parking. And so we did a lot of parking analysis and parking surveys to figure out what the utilization was. It was less than 30%, and in most areas, less than 20%. And each block was about, say, 400 feet long. In other words, you'd have to go, even if you lived mid-block, you wouldn't have to walk more than 200 feet to get to a side street where there was on-street parking available, with the exception of one super block. And so within that segment, we charged Brian with coming up with a solution for that, which ended up being a parking bay, which we put sort of mid-block so that, again, folks wouldn't have to walk too far away from their house to access on-street parking, but that we would have a dedicated right-of-way that served the purpose of transportation. And so we would have that bikeway, and then we would have 2 travel lanes. Next slide. And then obviously to solve the creek, we said, let's put some more bridges in there. We started doing some estimates on some prefabricated bridges. And so we thought that was a relatively affordable option for us and said, okay, let's see where those should go. There was a Metro Waterways plan that was also developed about 10 years ago that identified locations where bridges made a lot of sense from a drainage perspective. And so using that as a guide, as well as where the transit stops were, we came up with a proposal of where those additional bridges should go. It included replacing that existing wooden bridge and installing 2 more. And then the image on the right shows the pink lines are where the existing path was on the west side of Hilliard Street. And then the new path that we were going to be building on East Amazon was on the east side of Hilliard. And when you watch the desire line of folks, especially runners who are trying to access the running path over on the east side of Hilliard, they were sort of going in a diagonal direction or as close to that as possible. And I started to doubt whether or not somebody on a bike would do a 2-stage crossing to make this. And so we also started looking at the possibilities of doing a diagonal bike signal, what that would mean for the level of service, what kind of timing would that require, what infrastructure was required. And Brian will talk some more about that as well. Next slide. Again, this was completely born through the public involvement process. Was, hey, our running trail is really bad. And when you guys put more bark mulch on top of mud, it just creates more mud. And so people were choosing to run in the bike lanes or choosing to run in areas that weren't designated for running path. In other words, they were running in our prairie restoration areas and creating some desire lines through there. And so obviously we knew that we needed to fix that with an improved surface. And Brian will show you the outcome of that. Next slide.
I think with that, it's my turn, Reed.
Yep. Thanks, Brian.
All right, thank you. Everybody, it's Brian. Bear with me, I'm not as good at speaking as Reed, but I think we can suffer through this. So the image you're seeing on the right, that was kind of a cutout of what we used to put in some yards, kind of as yard signs to give people an idea of what was coming. You can see it kind of depicts a lot of what we did on the project, a lot of the things that Reed already talked about. The shared use path down to Tugman, putting in the 2-way cycle track, the bridges that we were going to be putting in, weren't going to be putting in. What it doesn't show is it doesn't show the 2 road projects we did. It doesn't show that we did a reconstructive East Amazon and West Amazon kind of in preparation for the project. You know, like Reed had said, trying to get in there and do minimal impacts to the public, but giving them a really good facility when we were done. So first I'll talk about the shared use path. This is just a Google image kind of showing right where Reed was talking about, where we switched from the 8-foot, which had already come down from a 10-foot. We go from an 8-foot right here where the gentleman's walking with his pup. It kind of goes down to a 5-foot sidewalk. And the challenge you can imagine there is you've got people that are biking and walking in this area or scootering, and all of a sudden they're confined to 5 feet. You know, where are they supposed to go? You know, do the bikes go out in the road now, which is a heavily used transit lane? You know, what are we going to do with them? And so that's where it came into, let's continue the shared use path 2 blocks down to Tugman, which is the south of where we're looking. Things for design consideration is, you know, we all struggle with it in the urban environment, is where's the right of way? Do we have room to easily just, you know, do we want to take the sidewalk and add to the back of the sidewalk and leave that nice landscape strip? Or do we need to move towards the curb? And if we move towards the road, are we going to start triggering a stormwater? So in this project, we ended up kind of figuring out that we had some issues on both, and I'll get to that shortly. So the other concerns, challenges we kind of had to figure were, like I said, the transit. So we've got a bus shelter here, and it made for a really big conflict zone, right? So we've got a 5-foot sidewalk. We've got bikes and pedestrians who are trying to make it down to the park or to their home, and they're going to be going through this heavily used bus stop. And so you can see right here, we've got a conflict already, and that's just another Google image. I wasn't sitting there waiting for this. It's a natural occurrence. So how do we make this conflict zone safe? And you can also see kind of along the curb edge, you've got some damage due to buses. Now this Hilliard section, it's slated on our bond measure to get repaved probably about 2023, 2024. But you can see there's already heavily damaged and it's right here at the bus stop. So we wanted to address that since we were here. We wanted to make a good long-term facility. So there's some before pictures, and here is the after. So we'll start with bus shelter. You can see that has moved forward. We got a nice wide area for pedestrians to go around the back. One thing you'll notice is I actually kept, I don't know if you can see my arrow, but I kept the original bus pad, and that was for two reasons. One, the right-of-way goes through about halfway through that, so I didn't want to go in and excavate it and then have to get a temporary easement. It involved ODOT and all that good practice. So we left that there. So it helped out, though. It gives us more staging for the people waiting for buses. It gives us room if there's somebody that is staged kind of in the sidewalk. It gives room for somebody on a bicycle or a pedestrian to get around behind them. So it was actually kind of a win-win. So the shelter moved forward, kind of out of the way. It's an ADA compliant shelter and stop now, which is great. You can see where we added the concrete out in the road. That's a reinforced concrete bus pad. And you can also notice where we rebuilt the curb line, we added a pavement repair, and that pavement repair to the south, you can see that seam lines up with the concrete pad. I did that intentionally so that when we come and do a mill and fill on this project, we can just mill right along that edge 4 feet out, which is right down the middle of the travel lane. We don't worry about wheel path. And you can have a nice straight rotomill. You're not going in and out and causing future damage. So that'll be up to the new PM, but that was kind of my intent. That new asphalt paint repair is plenty thick. It's gonna have a good design life. So how I got around the right of way, in this case, when we wanted to get to a 10-foot wide path, was I actually bumped the curb out into the roadway 3 feet. This gave us room to add on to the sidewalk where we had good existing concrete. If you can see my cursor, kind of right behind that telephone pole, you can see some older concrete. And then up here in this top image, you can kind of see another little section. Lesson learned there was, as much as we were trying to save concrete and save resources, there was actually not really that much there to save. So it probably in hindsight would have been cheaper just to replace the whole thing. Now, at first, when we were originally looking at design, it seemed like there was probably more panels that were salvageable. But when you're talking a 5 to 8 year design and scoping and planning phase, you know, that damage just increases as you get closer to construction. So, you know, would I do that again? I don't know. I would definitely take a closer look at what are the existing conditions again, and being really mindful of what would I save, and maybe doing a more stringent cost evaluation. So you can see we added some ADA compliant ramps to the intersections. On the far right, you can see an aerial from Google, and you can kind of see that new concrete. So that's a new enough Google image. It shows you up towards the top of the alley going all the way down south to Tubman Park, which is this very south little piece. That's where we ended. And it makes a really nice connection for pedestrians and cyclists, and it's a safe, comfortable place for them to ride. One last little small design concept or design issue we came across was this nice sequoia. It's a private tree, so we really didn't want to get in there and try to look at removing it, but it had significant heating from roots. So to save it, we basically built a reinforced concrete bridge over the top of those roots. And I've been out there recently, about a year and a half later, and it still looks good. So that was a good save. All right, so next we move on to the running trail. So on the far right, you can see another Google image, and at the very top is the Hilliard and East Amazon. That's where East and West Amazon run into Hilliard. And it's kind of hard to see, but it's kind of long, kind of curved. It's all the way down to Frank King Park, and there's a little bit of a boot here. That running trail goes all the way down and around and basically makes a complete 5K loop, so 3.1. We did almost all of it. We did about 3 miles of it. The section down to Frank King Park had previously been done, so that didn't our help. But this trail, a lot of it, well, the original trail was just bark mulch thrown over soil. And as you can imagine, in this area, we had a lot of expansive clays that it would just eat up that bark mulch, whether it was when the clay dried up in the summer, like you can see in the bottom, and we would just get these huge cracks and fissures. I mean, 2 to 3 inches wide, that's an ankle breaker right there if you're running. Or in the winter, it was the exact opposite. It was just big mud holes. So this bark was constant being a maintenance issue. So we, teamed up with our parks department and said, okay, what can we do to fix it? So here's the after, small section of it, but we wanted a nice 6 foot wide plus shoulders, which became about 9 foot wide running trail. That way you could comfortably run next to your friend, or if you needed to bypass people, you could comfortably do that without feeling like you're being rude or a safety issue. So the way the overall design for this path was ultimately wanted it, like I said, the 6 feet wide. We wanted a nice full reconstruct, but as we started walking the corridor, we found areas that maintenance had already gone out there, our parks maintenance had already gone out there and done some work, throwing down rock and bark. And so it's like, well, in cases like that, where we've got a good structure, we don't need to fully reconstruct that. Let's save some of our resources. And there were some areas that we'd also had a nice 4 foot wide path that was built in, even though our idea was 6. So could we just widen it? And that was what we ended up doing. We ended up kind of having 3 different versions of the reconstruct for the running trail. It was either a full reconstruct, which included everything. It was, widening and doing a nice cap of bark, or it was just putting new bark down on the existing rock. I'd say probably 70% was a full reconstruct. So on the left, you can kind of see what that means, what the reconstruct was. The full structure was 12 inches thick, but we only did six inches of excavation. And that's because we wanted to elevate the trail. We didn't want it down at grade. We wanted to keep it above. So because of rain and the water wanting to get from the back of curb into what you see on the right, the trees, which is where the channel is, or the creek. So that's kind of where it came in, the 2 different types of rock. Obviously we put down the fabric to kind of separate us from the clays to the rock, but then we did 6 inches of 1.5 inch open quarry rock, so that as water is flowing through, it might get down in that excavated hole, but the quarry rock would allow that water to flow through easily and back out. And we used quarry versus what we normally use as river rock down here in the Southern Valley. We use quarry rock just because it locked in so much better. And then I capped that with 3 inches of 3/4 minus, again, mostly for a cap. One, it helps lock in any kind of rocks with the minus, but it also keeps the bark from falling down into the 1.5 open. So it create a nice structure, a cap, and it helps keep our bark from wanting to float away. And ultimately trying to get as much life out of it in the least amount of maintenance. Then capped it with 3 inches of bark mulch. That's common for our running trails around here. It's easy to blow in with a blower, and that's what our parks maintenance desire.
Hey, Brian, there's a couple of questions here that I think are probably a little bit relevant to the slides that you just went over. So Tim asks about the concrete bus pad, and do you see redding in all the wheel paths of the stop? Just asking why you just stopped along the curb side.
Yeah, so we only saw it on that outside edge, and it could be, and this is me kind of just making a wag here, but it's quite possible there's such a crown in that road that they put a lot more pressure on those outside wheels. It could be something back to when that road was originally built. Maybe our structure kind of feathered out to something thinner. I'm not 100% sure. We didn't, to be honest, I didn't do cores in that area, but it was heavily damaged enough, especially once we got closer to design, because that was probably a couple years after that Google image. But yeah, we only saw damage right there at the stop. That pad is about 70 feet long, even though it didn't look like it. So it was really where the bus is coming in, hitting the brakes, and then taking off again.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I'm an engineer here in Eugene too, and I feel like that's what I typically see too around town, is that most of our failures under the bus loads are right along the curb line and not necessarily out on the wheel the wheel path on the other side away from the curb. So Emma also asks about the funding source for the running trail.
Yeah, we got a lot of that kind of we used from the federal grant, but we weren't able to cover all of it once we started looking at how extensive the damage was. And when it started getting to the point where we needed to reconstruct, almost 70%, if not more, of that running trail, we leaned on our parks department. And to be honest, I'm not sure if that was from one of their park grants, or I think it might have been park SDCs, but I know that that came from our parks department.
Yeah, I don't remember that they had a grant. I thought that they used either their SDCs or they have a park bond as well to pay for capital projects.
Yeah, park bond, that's what I was looking for.
And then Carrie also has a question about weed control in the bark mulch. You might not be able to answer that. That might be a parks question, but do you know what they're doing around that?
I don't know that they, yeah, I guess I couldn't answer that and with a real good answer as far as, confidence. I don't know that they're spraying out there now because we've got so many protected species, and I'm not sure what they do for weed control. Sorry.
And I think that's it.
Great. Okay. With that, we'll move on to the bridges. So this is the one that was existing. We like to call this the 39th Avenue Bridge because it lines up with 39th Avenue. In that left image, you can, if you squint really tight, you can see through all those trees and you can see the Kincaid Park on the other side. Right now we're standing on West Amazon looking east to East Amazon. The challenges with this bridge, and Reed already hit a lot of it, was one, it was the only bridge in the area. It's old, it was continual maintenance due to the wood just getting deteriorating. It was narrow, once you got past these two little openings, you might fit two people, but it wasn't comfortable at all for a pedestrian, a cyclist, or even a cyclist probably. I'd venture and say this is probably kind of a scary crossing when it comes to if it gets dark. There's no lighting in there, and just all the overgrowth from those trees, made it probably not a very comfortable crossing in the evening and dusk. And then also, as you can see, it's just not ADA compliant. There's a lot of grade change there. It's asphalt that's fallen apart. It just was not conducive for all modes and abilities. So the old bridge, we got to remove it. So we were able to remove it in one piece. It was bolted down to some pretty small foundations. And once we undid those bolts, it was just a one-time pick. And it was great because we didn't have to worry about containment of debris. We had our aspects in place for debris, obviously, but it just picked right up and was really easy. Just put on a flatbed and away it went. So that made room for the new bridges. So partnered with KPFF and GRI for the structural work and the geotech. Here you can see the bridge that had been brought in on the crane. This was a bridge from Contact. It was prefabricated. And then it's going to get a concrete deck over the top and concrete approaches into it. This image and a future image will show you really well that this bridge is quite a bit above existing grade. And we did that, basically for one main reason, and that was to stay out of the channel and the wetlands. Or the wetlands in the area reach to about top of bank, sometimes about a foot or two outside top of bank. And to minimize having to do any kind of wetland delineation, well, we did the delineation, but to do any other wetland riparian work, we said, well, let's just build over the whole thing. And that saved us, anywhere from 6, 9, 12 months of design time and, the resources, the funding. So that was a great win. All of our bridges range from 45 to 55 feet in span. So not huge, it was easily designable. And so here's an example of one of them as we're working through. Same bridge, other view is the finished one. We don't have all the wing wall rails on here yet, but you can see the finished concrete deck and approaches. This is on West Amazon, looking east again in the same area that the original bridge was, downstream a little bit. But you can see the park is there, it's open, it's more friendly. It's a direct line with a new crosswalk, much more comfortable, 12 feet wide, so you can get 2 bikes across there, even if somebody was standing, you know, enjoying the scenery. So really nice looking bridge. So as I'd mentioned before, you know, we were trying to span over the wetlands and the channel. And that brought in a couple issues that we had to design around. It wasn't, you know, a big issue, but that bottom left picture, you can see this is our 37th Avenue Bridge. We were at 18 inches to 2 feet above the existing road. And because of the channel location, we were up against the road once our bridge came down on its foundation. So you can see we had kind of a two-way split for an ADA compliant bridge. We added the rails, you know, obviously for safety. If somebody on a bicycle or a skateboard per se was flying across the bridge and decided just to take a jump off that concrete platform, you know, they'd be right in the road. So really discouraging that and just creating a safe environment for all cyclists of ages to be able to access the crosswalks and the running trail. So this also acts as a spot for the running trail that kind of goes north and south, and they can go up and over. On the top right, or the top center, that is up at Dillard. So this is at the school that Rita talked about where the kids like to cross the creek. And there was really good evidence of them doing that, going down and up. And, you know, we don't want to deteriorate our channel banks. Plus, we don't want kids going into school with muddy, wet feet. You know, that's not good for anybody. So this was a really important spot for the third bridge. And you can see the school in the background. And then the bottom right picture, this is the same bridge as the top one, Dillard. But again, we had some grade issues. We were well above the road grade to stay out of the wetland. This bridge also served as a water crossing for our utility, local utility, EWEB. And they only had a couple crossings in the area, so they didn't have any kind of a redundant system. So this new line that came in helped with that redundancy. So one of the things I'll talk about later was a lesson learned, and that water line added to it. So we'll get to that in a little bit. Ready right now? Yes. So lessons learned. When you're working with, you know, this is new for the City of Eugene. Well, new for me anyways at the city. We mostly do all of our own design. So in this project, I had my plans as the civil plans. We had structural plans. We had utility plans from EWEB. And then all that had to go into Contact and the rebar manufacturing and shop drawings. And so it was really an eye-opener to me and my team on how to make sure all of that matches. And how that ties into kind of that second lesson learned was the wetland boundary, was when we put that water line in underneath the bridge, we made sure that the bridge and the deck were all out of the water line or out of the wetland boundary, but we forgot about the water line going underneath there and through the wetland boundary. So as an 11th hour design, I mean, it was an addendum, to be honest. We had to raise that whole bridge a foot. And, you know, that gave a little bit of heartburn to myself and KPFF, but we were able to work together and get that bridge lifted so that nothing was in the wetland, because, you know, that's one of the promises we've made to the environmental folks. And then this last one's going to lead to my next slides, and that is that expansive soil really does expand. So,
Hey, Brian.
yes.
I thought I would just kind of jump in here because it looks like, I mean, before you get totally off the bridges. So there's a couple of questions about lighting. Did we add lighting to the bridges?
I guess it won't matter to go back. We did not. What we ended up doing is the bridges are near existing street lights. So they're up at a 35, 45 foot elevation. And we also made sure working with our urban forestry and parks, we opened up the area around the bridges in all 3 locations to allow a lot more light and visibility into where the bridges locations were.
And then there is a question kind of relevant to one of the pictures that you're showing right now. The dark truncated dome panels, is that a city standard?
Mm. So those are cast iron. They are meant to be, as you can see in the bottom left, black. So those bottom left ones are Masco. It's a concrete dome. And that's what we preferred, but that company went out of business. And so between that left bottom and the right bottom, there was about a year difference. And I'll explain why there was a difference there. But the bottom right one is cast iron, and they show up with an asphaltic cover, which is black. But about half of them, they end up getting this kind of patina to them. So that was not the original intent. That's what we have now. But the great news is it matches my bridge rails, right?
So I guess the answer to the question is yes, that dark is the city standard. Although, like you mentioned, we typically would see the concrete, the black concrete being typically used, but with those not really being available anymore, we have been seeing more of the cast iron ones, and we had to update our standards because we actually don't really like the asphalt coated ones very much. And so this is kind of new for us to have the weathering, the patina that gets to them. And so we'll see how that goes, but we do like the dark color better. And then the final question here is about design flood concerns regarding the bridges.
Yes.
I'll let you go ahead and try.
Yeah, so that was another part of the elevation of the bridge. Actually appreciate that reminder. So on top of being above the wetland, it was also being above and outside of the 100-year flood. So our foundations are included in that. On all excavation, we made sure to span that 100-year floodplain. I hope that answers the question. Thank you. And then to kind of add to the domes question, I sat in on a couple different webinars around this that talked about colors, and they showed kind of what a perspective of, depending on what level of eyesight you have, from a 20/20 to complete blindness, it showed what you see in perspective. And the takeaway I got was that the darker domes, black included, and I'd even go with the patina, actually gives a better contrast than like the yellow. The yellow is great for us that have visibility, that can see it as a warning, but for those who are sight impaired, it actually blends in more with the concrete than the darker. It gives you less contrast. That was from a webinar I saw, and feel free to, I think it'd be a great thing to look into. Okay, so back to
actually, there's still a couple more questions, it turns out.
Yay. Okay. What questions you got? Denver, I think we lost you.
Oh, sorry.
Oh.
I gotta keep the mute button or cleared. Anyway, so the question talks about best practices for managing a project that spans planning through engineering, multiple different project managers, public communications, lots, design and technical project delivery. So there was a lot that kind of had to span, and I don't know if you'll get to that a little bit more. You've touched on it a little bit.
As far as best practices, the biggest thing has been communication. Reed and I, we meet from the planning and engineering, we meet every other week, if not more. Luckily for me, I've been with the city throughout the different project manager changes, not as a project manager to start with, but also Reed has been there from the beginning. So really leaning on all the different resources I have from personnel and relationships, and it's really helped to have that relationship and that respect for one another. As far as Reed's really good at his job, and he's really good at seeing that I've got a role to fill, and how can he help me and how can I help him. So I'm not sure if that answers the question fully, but I just think communication is such a big piece of what we do.
Hey, Brian, and Carrie has another question. I'm going to go ahead and allow him to talk here. Go ahead, Carrie. You'll have to unmute yourself.
I don't have a question. I don't know if it popped from the older one or not.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll go ahead and lower your hand and we can continue on.
Great. Well, thank you everybody for the questions. Okay, so when it came to the concrete within kind of the linear park that Reed was talking about, we have the bridge approaches, and then we also, which I'll talk about a little bit more on the top left, is kind of a shared, well, not even a shared use path, a bike path that takes you from the diagonal crossing at Hilliard to the cycle track. So that concrete was all within this linear park that really hadn't been touched by anything, you know, other than maybe as a lawnmower. So this area we knew was very expansive clays, and we'd done some ADA ramps across the street as part of our paving project. So we had some experience with it. And so that led to my original design for the concrete, and that was 6 inches of concrete on 6 inches of rock on fabric. You know, normally that would be an overkill for a sidewalk. But, you know, we knew we had expansive clay, so let's go for it. So we built, in year one, we built the top left picture, which is the bicycle, kind of the bike path. That was only in year one as far as the concrete work goes in the linear park. That concrete, shortly after, what you can see to the right with the tape measure, started cracking. And at first you would want to, you know, kind of blame the contractor for construction equipment, but what you can't really see is the full sign of this crack, and this crack starts doing kind of a wave, kind of a sine curve look to it. And, you know, that was it's not a crack you would see from construction. So we watched it over the next 6 months, and that crack continued to grow horizontally and vertically. So we said, okay, it's time to come up with a new design. So between phase one, which was in 2018, and phase two, which was to put the bridges in and the approaches, we said we need to rethink our concrete. So we said, next design, we're going to do 6 inches of reinforced concrete with number 4 bars, 12 inches on center each way, on 12 inches of rock on fabric. So we're like, okay, we're getting rid of more clay. We're creating concrete that if there is some movement, swelling contraction, at least it'll move together. So let's see how well that works. So we did that. We rebuilt these cracks you see on the bike path portion. And I'm happy to report that turned out fine or great. It never had any issues. Unfortunately, a handful of the bridge approaches, it worked just fine, but right at where the ramp is down to the domes, that last or first panel, however you want to look at it, it moved about 1 inch to 1.5 inches, which you can see in the bottom left with that smart level. So that whole thing raised again in the next winter. And, you know, it was interesting because the curb line didn't move. It stayed right there with the asphalt. There was nothing pointed up there. It only moved in that first panel. So at that, I said, okay, our approaches, if they're moving together like we anticipated. So there's no need to worry about that. So right there at the ramp, which is the 1 panel plus wings, we're going to just go overkill. We're going to go 12 inches of reinforced concrete on 24 inches of rock and fabric. Yes, that is super overkill, but it was such a nice, small, isolated areas. It was worth it. You know, we did not want to come back again. So that was what we came up with. And thank goodness it's working just great. There was some contemplation that would, we might have seen heating the sidewalk adjacent to it because that would want to move, but we tied it all together, and you know, now another 9 months later, it's all working great. So lessons learned there. Soils, they can move a lot more than we think. Okay, so here is the protected two-way cycle track. This is right at the corner of Hilliard and East Amazon, another Google image. And you can see kind of this desired line of people that are coming from this trail and they're coming up to this corner. This is what you'll see. This is where our new bike path comes in and kind of curves down onto the roadway. So left, you've got the existing Google image. Right, you've got the new. You can see Hilliard going north-south, East Amazon kind of going north-south, but off at that angle to the right. You can see the bike path that connects the two-way cycle track on the right bottom up to the diagonal. You can see the new Rexius running, well, sorry, I don't want to call it Rexius running trail, but the new running trail. You can see how much wider it is, more effective. So a good before and after. Here they've got the cycle track, or the, bike path coming down. Here I wanted to talk about this kind of white lead-in line. Because the curb line bumps out essentially 12 feet, we had the room, we were able to move the cars over, but I found that having this lead-in line really helped push cars over sooner and safer. It was much easier to see that fog line than if you were driving up and then all of a sudden you can, I don't know if you kind of see my cursor, it's a yellow curb there. The yellow curb is a great add-on, but really having that lead line to guide you, to me, I've noticed when we've done bump outs for parking bays, or we've done bump outs for planters, that lead-in line really makes a big difference for vehicles. And then on the right, you can kind of see it in practice, kind of that lead-in line just helps you around smoothly. And you can see where that path jumps out from the existing curb line. So then looking up the ramp, this is kind of the opposite view looking north. You can see where that path comes around and down into our cycle track. So we got the two-way cycle track with the protection. The separators we opted to go with were going to be concrete. The contractor was able to choose whether they want to do extruded or form and pour in place. Originally, honestly, that's what they wanted to go with. I had intended it always being an extruded application. So what the design we came up with was 18 inches wide, 4 inches tall at the center with the tapered sides. The tapered sides, there's a reason for that. And for the bicyclists, it's what we call pedal strike. If your curb was too high and you were trying to ride next to the curb because you were riding side by side or passing somebody, you wouldn't want your pedal to hit it and cause an accident. So you have that taper so you don't, your pedal won't come down and hit the concrete. As far as the width goes, that was kind of the best we could do in the area. Try to still maintain good travel lanes, good sized bike lane, and buffer. That was the size that the real estate allowed for us. As far as the length goes, we went 25 feet long with 5-foot gaps. Those 5-foot gaps were intended so people that live along the corridor, if you're at a mid-block, you could just shoot across the road and get into the bike lane easy without going all the way down to an intersection and getting on at one of these T intersections. It also made openings for stormwater, so there's kind of a double bonus there. So as far as some vertical elements to it, we added tubular markers on every other separator. We did that so that it didn't look like a fence line of vertical posts, and also to try to minimize kind of the aesthetics, the maybe not appealing aesthetics to the homeowners that live there and want to see the channel. They don't want to see a bunch of tubular markers, so we try to make it and separate them every other. And then we also used, instead of regular RPMs, we use these glass cat eye reflectors, which I'll talk about here shortly. And that was just for a maintenance issue and hopefully for more visibility. Here you can kind of see them getting set up for the extrusion. What you're seeing down there is a plywood or kind of a bender board, and that was in the gaps. And that was so that they could essentially just pour right over it and never have to start and stop the curb machine. It kind of worked the first day. It made a bit of a mess. And so they kind of opted to, they actually went more to a visqueen. It seemed to work a little bit easier. Here you can see we've done the lane shifts and we're ready to go. So here's the cat eyes I was talking about. They come with a rubber boot. And the nice thing about this is once you core the hole, You core the hole and you stick the boot in there. There's no epoxy and it goes down and has that gasket that it's kind of hard to tell, but right in about the middle of that gasket's got a little flare. So it'll go easily, but it won't come back out, kind of like a barb on a hook. The one thing to kind of note and to watch as an inspector is to make sure they don't drill too deep. The application that's there now looks good, but some of them they went too deep. And when you do that, the little, the eye part of the reflector is not sticking up high enough to get enough light to reflect. But again, we went to these because they're down in, they're not going to pop out, they're not going to get run over. It's way less maintenance. It's got a 360-degree reflection, so it's helpful for the bikes and the vehicles using the corridor. Okay, as we mentioned, this cycle track is only along the park side. So it meant for a lot of T intersections at these side roads. This shows an application of what we did. The gap was big enough for bikes to come in and out. What you're seeing here is what we'd like to call like a bike box, kind of a staging box, so that if in this case you're, say, heading south and want to cross, you can go get in that staging box, and bikes going north, you don't have a conflict zone. So we did, it's kind of hard to see here a little bit, but the yellow line kind of veers around that bike box and kind of makes a nice staging area. This flexible marker is what the permanent application was, not the candlestick cones you're seeing down there further. The ones that we had here in the middle, we actually made them as a quick release. So it's just a quick release pin, so you can pull that, and it allows for maintenance to get in there with a sweeper and sweep out the leaves and debris. And then put it back easily. So some of the lessons learned, as you saw in that previous picture, when you're setting the string line for your curb machine, you got to drill holes in your brand new asphalt. Normally we think of curb machines and there's a landscape behind it and it's not a big deal, but in this case we've got asphalt and they need that guidance for the horizontal and vertical. So we allowed them to do it, and then we filled it back in with a sealer. Hot tape. So I don't know if you guys have used hot tape before. It's a good application. It works well. It rolls in with your hot mat. We used it under the intentions that it was going to peel off easy. That was kind of what we had been sold on. And so we figured we'll put down our new asphalt. We'll do this hot rolled tape. And then when we come back the next year, all you need is torch, and you can just torch it and it peels right up. Well, it did come right up, but it left adhesive. And you can kind of see in this picture, you can see my cursor, that adhesive isn't bad in low light or during the day, but in the early mornings, it leaves a glare that's almost as bright as the yellow center line. And the rain, it also catches. So now it's been about 1.5 years, and it's getting better, it's wearing out. But my lesson learned there would be just do temporary paint and come back with a small micro grinder. A temporary paint's gonna wear out pretty quick. So that hot tape is a good product, probably not good for temporary use. Another thing that I would say is, even though we put the gaps in the concrete, check your stormwater, check your curb line. We didn't check the curb line, over here as well as we should have. And so what that meant is we created a couple bike lane, bike path, what do we want to call them? Baths, I guess. So we had to go in there and do some curb and gutter repair. It would have been nice to have done that ahead of time, but it's just one of those things, lessons learned. Look at it. Make sure you don't have any puddles on the roadside of your curb as well, because that's just going to create a pond that's going to splash the cyclist on the other side. So pay close attention to the storm. Again, I talked about being able to get a sweeper in there, and that's where we have this quick release bollard or a flexible marker. Maintenance of the stripe in the cycle track itself. We did a thermo with the intention that this thermo along the curb is probably never going to get maintained again, but it was a good, get people used to the facility. If that goes away, we still have the curb there. I don't think it's a deal breaker. The one on the vehicle side, that can still be maintained by our maintenance department, so not an issue. And then the center yellow, it's in a bike facility. Its lifelong, or its design life is going to be a lot longer than in a vehicle in the roadway. And another consideration when you are removing parking and you are now making 2 vehicle lanes, think about your garbage trucks, mail trucks, delivery trucks. What do you anticipate them doing? In this case, they're going to go down and they're going to do their stops and people are going to be patient. But that's in a complete residential section of the road. What do you do in a more business, commercial area? So just food for thought. Okay, moving on to the diagonal crossing. So we got a before and after. My little lightning nope down there at the bottom is what Rita talked about. A lot of our runners that would be running on the trail, they would come up and they'd want to be going over across the street to the shared use path, and they would essentially just pick an opening in the gaps in the cars and just dart across. You can see up at the top, we only had 3 legs of the crosswalk. We didn't have a crosswalk on the south side. So the runners would just find a spot and go for it. So we said, okay, we don't want that. We obviously don't, we also don't think that bikes are going to make a 2-stage turn, as Reed alluded to. So how can we minimize and facilitate all the modes? So we added the crosswalk on the south side. You can see in the right picture in the diagonal crossing. Now, sometimes the runners are using that diagonal crossing, but that diagonal crossing is fully intended just for cyclists. Just as we've shown with the striping, the timing is for cyclists. However, knowing that there's, we design and what practice is going to be may vary. We did put some safety, what do I want to say, concerns in there, not concerns, but some other safety precautions. We'll get to it when we talk about the signals more in depth. And here we go. So we added, FLIR was the company, these FLIR cameras. You can see in the top left picture, I hope you can see that picture. What that camera does is if you are a cyclist that's either coming from the cycle track up here in my top left, or from the shared use Amazon path, if you're coming in, you're going to have a near side signal, which you see here. If you can follow my cursor, that's the near side. That's pointing down the existing shared use path. If you see that turning yellow and you think that you're going to go all the way across this diagonal and you're going to go for it, well, if that cyclist decides to and they enter kind of the green area, that camera is actually pointing down at the green. It's not to detect that a bike is coming and waiting. It's to detect that a bike is in a danger zone and that bike is not going to make it across in the time allowed. So that triggers the light to extend the delay in the red, and it gives that cyclist time to get across. So that was kind of the fail-safe, right? And if that was the same with somebody who was running, if they didn't make it all the way across in time, you would get a little bit of delay. We did everything we could with signs and striping to show that this is only for cyclists, but we can't control everybody. So again, we got near side signals, which actually have the bike symbol on it. So it's really easy to tell this is for bikes. And then you can kind of see here, this shows this is the far side for the opposite side of the diagonal. Yeah. And here we've got our finished product. And this is actually a picture of our very first users, which was kind of exciting. These kids probably went back and forth, 4 to 6 times. And the moms on the far side just watch them. And it was a really good experience. You can see that far side signal with the bicyclist symbol. The other thing we added for safety is this no turn on right, or no turn on red right. That's an LED. It's quite bright, as you can tell. This only turns on if somebody's using the diagonal crossing. If they're not using the diagonal crossing, we leave that off so that right turns are permitted, just to help with capacity and help with flow. With that, it's going to lead us to, we've got a short video.
Hey, Brian, before you go to the video, you've got a few questions about this last section that you went through.
Okay, great.
Ryan is asking about the bridge railings, and did you have a corrosion protective coating on those?
So we made sure they had a patina to them. That's what we wanted. We wanted them to kind of, they're steel, but we wanted to kind of match the natural environment. So that is a purposeful weathering steel. And then same with the handrails, we did the same. We did add kind of I'm not sure what you would call it, but we did add an agent to the top of the concrete below the railing. So if there was any kind of post patina weathering, it wouldn't stain the concrete. And that seemed to work pretty well.
And have you considered using lime stabilization on the subgrade to deal with the clay soils heaving?
There was some conversation about it. We hadn't, just because of some of the issues we've had with lime and just other kind of chemicals, like when we do our FDR, that, you know, the slurry, not the seal, but the cement powder, and, you know, it can be kind of a nasty chemical. And so we try to avoid that when we can.
Do you have product information for the cat eye reflectors?
Yeah, I mean, they're in our, we actually adopted into our specifications now. US Reflector is the company that will most likely come up, but if you Google tempered glass cat eye reflector, you'll come up with 2 or 3 different companies that make them.
And Emma is asking about how much did the signal work, bikes traffic signal cost at the intersection, including design engineering?
I'd have to dig that up. That might take a little bit, but I can get back with Emma if we have an email address.
Okay, I think that is the questions.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Okay, so the video, I'm gonna try to narrate it because our audio is not great, so bear with me, sorry. All right, so you can see our diagonal crossing, and oh, see if this comes up. So right now we're in our cycle track. We're trying to talk about, this is our ridgeline trail that Reed talked about, and then our river path. So a lot of use. This is our existing Amazon shared use path that was in, that we've had for a few years now that we wanted to connect. Then here's the new 2-way cycle track that we just talked about. It's the kind of south end, or the headwaters, I like to say. Here we go, going across the Hilliard to the diagonal crosswalk. So this, you know, the really intent was all ages and abilities. We wanted a safe place for, you know, we've got 2 elementary schools in the area, lots of residents. We want this, we want parents to feel comfortable riding with their kids, kids feeling comfortable riding to school and home. And here we kind of got, you can see the cycle track on the left, you can see the running trail heading down, and just how it all kind of winds together as a nice little corridor. There we go. We can see that no right turn on red popped up, and it's nice and bright. And you can see the signal of the pedestrian or the bicycle signal. So here's kind of another part of our downtown that we're trying to connect to. This is the last stage. We're going to go from our Amazon channel, which is this, our Amazon path, down to our river. So one more big connection that we're hoping to see here in the next couple of years.
Hey, Brian, on those, oops, on those no right turn stops or signals, have you seen a compliance issue with those?
Oops, sorry, I didn't mean to play that again. I haven't noticed it. I mean, it's amazing how bright those things are. I'm not sure on a compliance issue. I could definitely talk to our traffic operations and see if they've seen anything. I will say, kind of something as a heads up, is there's only one manufacturer / supplier in Oregon. So there is quite the lead time for those. It seems like it'd almost be an off the shelf, but that's got more lead time than probably anything else out there in this that we did on this project.
And then there's a question about that bike signal time extension, stop triggering.
Yeah.
Is there a limit on how long it extends that after a certain number of lengths or a certain number of cyclists? How does that work?
That's a really good question. I've kind of wondered that myself. I don't know, to be honest. My belief is it's once, but you know, being that it's meant for the safety side of things, it seems like it would probably continue again. I'd have to get back on that.
I mean,
But I-
I'm assuming that the bike signal still turns red. So theoretically, nobody else is continuing through, but
That's my understanding.
it just delays the car's signal from turning green.
Yeah. Kind of thinking about this same diagonal, kind of one of the things that we also took in consideration was how much striping are we going to do for this diagonal? We really want it to be a safe place. We want bikes to know to use it. But if we green the whole thing, it's going to be just a maintenance nightmare. You know, just a maintenance department out there constantly fixing the green, which is a safety thing for our maintenance department. And it's also a traffic control issue. It means we're out there multiple times stopping traffic and closing lanes. So we opted to just do it at the beginning and ends. And you can see, because it's a diagonal, there is no really good wheel path to pick. So that's kind of where we came up with the green and kind of the configuration there. And then kind of lastly, we get to just some additional safety stuff that we worked on throughout the project. This whole thing, again, was for multimodal, a safe place for all ages and abilities. So one of the things we did, other than putting an excavator down the middle of the road, was we narrowed the lanes. So the lane coming that we're driving in is 11 feet wide, and then the lane coming up against the curb is 12 feet wide. So that seemed to have some impact on the speeds, because before we were seeing, I think our mean speed was 41 and a 35. I mean, people were going faster and slower, obviously, but they were going very fast, very uncomfortable. So as part of the project, we reduced the speed down to 30 and reduced the lane widths. When I drive it, I find that 30 is a comfortable speed, and I wouldn't want to go any faster. And so we see that. The other thing we did, which turned out to be a maintenance issue, our maintenance department did it for us later, because we wanted to kind of see how our design worked before we went further. And that was to add a four-way stop at Fox Hollow. So that far right picture, it shows East Amazon to the right, West Amazon to the left. West Amazon has a four-way stop. And so people that wanted to, you know, kind of get through the corridor quicker would use East Amazon, because it did not have a four-way stop. So because of this bus stop here and the connection to a church up here and a bunch of housing over here, we said, you know, it's time. We need a four-way stop East Amazon as well. Or yes, East Amazon as well. So I believe that's helped. You know, we don't have people trying to choose which side is going to be faster at this point. Now it's, you know, the traffic is going to stay kind of where they need to be. And not that we're trying to separate, you know, the neighborhood, but trying to even out the amount of volume on both roads. And we've seen positive impacts with that. So with that, I think we're to the last slide. Questions for myself and Reed.
Hi, okay, great. So we don't have any questions in the queue right the moment. I will give folks a couple minutes to see if anyone wants to put in a question or raise their hand. It is 1:23 according to my clock, so we just have a few minutes here. While I kind of give people a chance to ask any questions, I mean, you did take questions as we went through. Just a reminder that the recording will be available on the YouTube channel for the Oregon chapter, and to go ahead and save a copy of your email confirmation from Zoom when you register for the conference, as well as a flyer that you can get on the chapter website for your records for any PDF credits.
Jennifer, I had been answering some of the questions along the way in the chat box.
Yeah, so on those questions, would you go ahead and just kind of go through some of those questions? Because I think you might have just responded directly to the person who asked the question, or to us panelists, and it didn't necessarily go to all the attendees. Okay. And I do have a couple of questions that popped up in the Q&A box as well now.
So Jenna Berman asked what the lane widths were reduced to. They are either 11 or 12 feet, depending on the road width. We tried to keep the wider lane away from the cycle track, so that northbound lane on East Amazon adjacent to the curb is the wider lane. But we went out, Brian and I went out and measured after we got some complaints, and they're definitely at least 11 feet wide and sometimes 12. Carl McNair is wondering about the use of the path. It's pretty good. We opened it pre-COVID, and so it was an active Safe Routes to School route. We had really good ridership on it. We noticed a wider range of users too. But we do plan to do counts if we ever return to normal. But anecdotally, it's working very well. And we can monitor the signal actuations from remotely. And so that we know that signal's running all day long too. And I think that's a mix of people biking and people running. Christy Kruger asked if the facility actually goes all the way to the Ridgeline Trail. It doesn't. It ends just short of there. But East and West Amazon transition from collector arterial streets to local streets. And our intention would be to do more of a neighborhood greenway treatment on those streets. They're low speed and low volume. And so they're generally pretty comfortable for most people to operate on. And then Joseph Jenkins is my last one. Why was the scramble cycle not included for people who walk or run? I think that has to do largely with the clearance interval. It was just too high for the ped crossing. I think corner to corner was, gosh, Brian, do you remember? It's well over 100 feet. And so it was just too long of a clearance phase to be able to do that. But we do reserve the right to go back and adjust that if we need to. And so it's there. The intention right now is to make sure that it works great for bikes. We have a FLIR camera aimed right in the middle of the intersection. So if folks get to a stale green, they don't get caught in the middle of the intersection. And I think the runners have figured that out too, although we're not certain that the FLIR technology will detect a runner the same way it will somebody riding a bike. So that's why we're saying it should be used for people riding bikes. Jennifer?
So I also just want to clarify the funding question. So I think that in your presentation, you talked about bike ped funding and also the federal grant, but I just kind of want to separate that out a little bit because when we're talking about federal grant, we're talking about MPO funding and our surface transportation program. And so that's a little different than kind of a statewide competitive grant program. And then our local funds, can you talk a little bit about, because that's a pretty big mix of different local funds that were part of this program.
Yeah. We had quite a few different pots of money in this one. Try to get, being that there's so many different aspects to it.
So if I recall correct, so you did mention that City of Eugene has a street bond that's used for paving, but there's also funding as part of that street bond that was passed by our voters that does pay for active transportation projects too, in addition to the paving. So I know that we might have supplemented with some of that. We also use some transportation SDCs to make our match with federal funds. Are there some others that you can think of?
No, I think you summed it up.
Well, and I know that eWeb also participated in the project to help pay
true.
for
That's
any additional beefing up of the structure that we had to do to accommodate their water lines.
Yeah, they helped with that, kind of the additional little bit of engineering that went into it, as well as the actual infrastructure itself for the pipeline.
So do you want to, I don't know if you and Reed can take a look at the Q&A box. It's kind of, there should be on your toolbox there, but there's a couple questions about bike lanes around the end of Snell and on the south side. Is there any plan to connect them? Actually, Reed, you might have already addressed Rex's question when you talked about the neighborhood greenway.
Right, those are local streets, and so there'd be more of a neighborhood greenway treatment where it's a shared lane condition. On-street parking is also not highly utilized there, so it could be that we do add a facility of some type to it, but right now it seems to be working okay. And if conditions with COVID improve, we would like to do some intercept surveys down there too to see what kind of demand there is for some improvement. But right now, my observation is that it's working pretty well.
And did you consider up on the north end where we use the white striping to transition vehicles through past the curb bump out? Did we ever consider having a curved planter area extended in there?
We didn't, being this is all a park area with specific prairie grasses and species, we really wanted to limit any kind of introduction of outside species. And so we kept the bike path away from the curb as long as possible. That's why it kind of S curves at the end rather than sooner, so that we'd have as much, we would maintain as much of the green area as possible. But no, I mean, the other part of it just probably being funding, this project being open as long as it was, we really needed to get the best product we could with the limited resources as time went on.
All right, well, we have one more question and then I think we're done. It is 1:30 right now, but the last question is with the additional, with the crossing that's pretty close to the scramble, have there been traffic conflicts created by the second nearby crossing?
I don't think it's due to the signal. So I would say that the location of that, and it's a rectangular rapid flashing beacon, which was conditioned as part of that multi-use building that went up on the corner of Amazon or Hilliard at 32nd. And I think the location of it is somewhat challenging because the signs for it are sort of obscured by trees. We've talked about this with our maintenance crews too, about limbing up the trees in that location. I don't think the signals are necessarily in conflict with each other. I think just the location of that RFB is what's challenging about it. And I think there are things we can do to make it more visible.
All right, well, thank you, Brian and Reed, for the presentation. It was a big project with lots of elements in there. So thank you for everybody for sticking with us, and we will see you, I guess, in a couple weeks. We have another session coming up. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.